As Labour, UKIP and the Lib Dems preach to the converted at conferences and spring events today, what parliamentary plans of attack do they have in place to swing the general public's vote? The Tories have always been at the forefront of using advertising techniques to try and sway the electorate, from the infamous Labour isn't working posters to this week's Saatchi ad featuring Ed Miliband in Alex Salmond's top pocket. With us, Sam Delaney, presenter, former editor of Heat magazine and author of Mad Men and Bad Men, What Happened When British Politics Met Advertising. Thank you for coming on the show. Let's talk about the advert first and whether you think it'll make any difference to the election.
Well, it's interesting. I think graphically it's a great execution because it does all the things that great political ads should do, which make a very simple message very clear and explicit in an amusing, easy to consume way. It does that really, really well. The question is the issue it's targeting the best issue? I mean, what most political advertisers will tell you is that they don't create prejudices, they exploit them. So they're trying to tap into the things that people are most worried about.
And it's already been spoofed, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Spoofed like the infamous David Cameron one, which we have up on one of the
that's
panels.
the very interesting thing now, is that, you know, we saw it a bit in 2010 at the last election, we'll see it even more now. Is that, you know, everyone in the world seems to be a Photoshop expert all of a sudden, which means that what we get is ads continually spoofed and counter-spoofed, you know. So we've immediately got David Cameron in the top pocket of Nigel Farage, which has been done presumably by some Labour Party supporter in a response to the Conservative ad. Will it make a difference?
Was it a supporter?
Mm-hmm. Well,
was it
we
more
don't know
conspiratorial than that?
Yeah, I mean, there is an issue whereby the ad agencies will run one campaign that's the respectable campaign and goes out on billboards and in newspapers and on TV and makes a sensible argument. And then you've got the stuff that you can't really get away with officially, which is being viciously personal about your opponents and swearing or being profane or offensive and just generally extreme. Now, you know, as a political party, you can't be seen to endorse that kind of advertising. However, it can be very effective, so it has a huge impact and can often be very entertaining. Therefore, there can be a shadow campaign whereby you use your advertising agency and all the creative brains within it to create this stuff that's far more extreme, which is a gift of a brief for advertisers. They love that stuff because they very rarely get to make up ideas with the gloves off. They can run that online, and if anyone accuses the politicians of commissioning content or advertising that demeans politics, they can deny all knowledge of it.
How convenient. Yeah. One of the very serious questions that you seem to pose again and again in this book as you trace advertising in recent years is whether it makes any difference, and somehow it seems to make a difference to the policies of the Labour Party, if anything.
Well, I wouldn't say the policies, but I would say the way in which politicians of every hue think about the way in which they communicate what their thinking and their policies and ideas to the public.
You talk about Covent Garden, Charlotte Street, these sorts of people hanging around with politicians and different cultures and old left-wing figures. You mentioned Tony Benn and you call them hardliners, talking about we don't want anything to do with this.
That's right.
As soon as this culture entered the Labour Party abolished Clause 4, and you talk about
I don't think in the book that I make a direct link, but what I do think is that they brought to the Labour Party the idea of, rather than an intellectual elite creating ideas which they then presented to the public and assumed the voters to fall into line, they brought some of the strategic thinking that they had learnt from consumer advertising, which is go out there, find out what your audience are thinking, find out what their fears are, their concerns are, their hopes for the future, and shape your policies accordingly.
I mean, you do talk about the fact that when people credit advertising to Tony Blair's election victory in 97, let alone the election victories of John Major, the polls showed, and in 1979 when Saatchi's first started helping Mrs. Thatcher, I mean, the polls already showed who was going to win.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a great quote.
So they didn't make any.
There's a great quote from Tim Bell in which he says, in 1987, we argued non-stop about the advertising, but the truth is the Conservative Party was so ahead in the polls, we could have put a big poster up in Piccadilly Circus that told everyone to F off, and we would have still won. Such was the Labour Party were effectively unelectable, and the Conservative Party were way ahead. However, I think my conclusion in the book is not, it's hard to identify what difference it makes to election results. And very often, as you correctly say, it makes no difference whatsoever. The big difference that even the politicians will admit that the advertising people had on them was the strategy, their thinking. It taught them how to think with a clarity.
Well, you say clarity, but you're boiling it down to a catchphrase or a logo like for a commercial product. But life is much more complex than that. Should these politicians be boiling down very complex policies to very simple ideas at all?
I think it's their democratic obligation to do so, because I think that we take part we as a society, we take part in an election once every 4 or 5 years, and most people are not engaged in the political process full time between those elections. Most people are not going to read election manifestos from the parties. They're not going to read even leader articles in broadsheet newspapers or watch news programmes. They're not going to do it. And why should they? There's a lot of legwork involved. I think it's the obligation of a modern politician to communicate what they are trying to say, the values they represent, in an accessible way.
So they're bombarded, but they're bombarded then by a lot of media which is owned by quite a few people that obviously are basically pro the system, the status quo. They're not going to, go far left or far right.
What you're talking about is the press is a separate issue, and I would.
But these are the same people that they are getting their information, however inadvertently, from that, and then we're boiling it down
with advertising
for that audience.
With advertising, what it helps them do is to communicate the values they stand for and the principles that they stand for in a way that is easy for the average voter, and I think it's the average voter that's the most important, and usually they're the ones that make the big difference. The people who are floated, a very small amount of people who are undecided right now and live in a constituency that is up for grabs. I mean, that number of people are very small, and also all the research says that those people, those floating voters who are living right now in seats that are kind of wavering in the middle between two parties, are likely to be the least politically engaged, but they nevertheless consider it an almost patriotic obligation to vote. So how do they make their decision? These are the people who effectively decide the result of the election, particularly this year in such a close run thing.
But then isn't it corrosive then to have people who advertise Coca-Cola go into that exact swing, the critical swing voter, and they're expected to persuade them one way or the other?
I don't think that their ads in those constituencies are going to make the fundamental difference. What I think is that the influence of these advertising people, not just at election time, but just their influence on politicians, their advice to politicians, giving them that sense that when you have got a message amidst a million other messages that all of us are confronted with in society each and every day of our lives, if you need to get it across, you need to do it with a clarity and a simplicity.
But it's not a movie pitch, is it? I mean, if you're going to explain the geopolitics of the Middle East,
I mean, would you think that everyone who votes are obliged to sort of make themselves abreast of all the complexities and nuance of a party's set of policies on everything? Because that's not the reality for the average voter's life. They want to vote, yes, they want to have a say, but I think it's almost sort of snobbish of us to expect every last person to kind of make themselves abreast of the full, vast, complex arguments that surround everything from foreign policy to energy policy to education policy. That's not going to happen. What do we want to know? We want to vote on the basis of the values that a politician and a party represent. And I think if they can communicate that to us in a way that is credible and sincere, and that's up to the politicians. I mean, whether or not they're telling the truth about what they stand for, that's not the business of the advertiser. What they can say is, this is what we're trying to communicate, and the advertiser can say, well, this is the best method with which to communicate it.
So I just want to ask one final question, because you were the editor of Heat magazine. The role of celebrities in this campaign, and in terms of how these political parties see it. There's not much in this book about that element. Do you think, that the most popular magazines, newspapers, most popular news is about celebrity? Do you think our major political parties and strategists, Obama's strategists who work for Labour and Tory, will be keeping one eye on the use of celebrity? I'm
not convinced that using celebrities will ever kind of have a big influence one way or the other. I think that, contrary to popular belief, my experience at Heat is that the audience who consume news about celebrities are well aware that this is completely meaningless fluff, but they don't care. It's a distraction for them from the day to day. People mistakenly believe that there is like a generation of morons who genuinely think that Kim Kardashian's new hairstyle is of fundamental importance. You know, everything I learned at Heat suggested that the vast majority of our readers saw it, you know, may also take a serious newspaper, but they consume celebrity stuff as a distraction, just as some of us watch football or knit.
Sam Delaney, we'll get onto that Kim Kardashian story as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.